Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more Conversations in the Digital Age. There have been roughly 60 terrorist plots in the United States since 9/11, with some 21 occurring in New York City. Most have been thwarted, some have not. With us is John Miller, Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counter-Terrorism in the New York City Police Department, and he is the man with the awesome responsibility of keeping us safe. John Miller comes from a journalistic background. His father was a newspaper columnist. He has been a senior correspondent for CBS News, a co-anchor with Barbara Walters. His career has also involved law enforcement. He served former Police Commissioner William Bratton in Los Angeles for 2 years as head of the LAPD Counter-Terrorism and Criminal Intelligence Bureau. After a stint at the FBI, he returned to CBS until January 2014, when he assumed his present position. John Miller, we're delighted to welcome you to the program.
Thanks, Jim.
Now, as an expert in counterterrorism, perhaps you can tell us something in answer to the core question on everyone's mind, and that is, will Trump's travel ban make us any safer?
I'm not sure what it's adding, in that if you took the travel ban as it was, which means you're going to go into extreme vetting, I'm not sure people had a full understanding of what the vetting that was in place was already. I mean, it took an average of 2 to 2.5 years for most immigrants from the 7 countries they were talking about to get through the process, particularly Syria, of being examined by database checks that ran through CIA data, National Counter-Terrorism Center data, FBI data, USCIS, the people that brings immigrants across and does the background checks for INS, was doing a terribly extensive job. So if it's going to be an extensive job, I don't know what they're going to add to it or do differently. But I think a lot of this was trying to actualize campaign promises with a flourish. I'm not sure what the substantive change was, because no one's explained what the extra vetting is.
Now, Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly testified before Congress that the court stay of the travel ban somehow or other imperiled national security. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
I'm convinced your men and women doing a good job. I'm just concerned about this notion that because a court is ruled and they have the right to rule, that if in effect they have somehow put this country at risk by this ruling, so say the president. Now, if in fact there have been some people let in since the court ruled, can you provide this committee with those apprehensions of people who otherwise would not have been let in?
I'm not so sure I understand the question. If let's just say, for instance, a person who is trying to get to the United States to do some harm, some terrorist attack, is coming in during this period that the courts have put a stay on our enforcement. We won't know that until that an individual is a bad person, until they do something bad.
Yeah.
But it's entirely possible that someone that's coming in, whether it's during this stay, during the court action, or previous to this period,
but
came here to do us harm.
But you don't have any proof at this point?
Not until the boom.
Not until the boom. Now, do you agree with them? Does the court stay put us at greater risk than we were before?
I don't think so. Most of the 60 terrorist plots against the United States, certainly most of the 21 against New York City, have been organized and orchestrated and conspired to by people who were legal permanent residents, here legally, U.S. citizens. So I think with the vetting in place, the likelihood of that is less of a threat than people who are already here. If you take a look at the Orlando nightclub shooter, here's an American who had been in Florida for a good deal of time and aspired to be a law enforcement officer. He wanted to be a deputy sheriff down there. You see him posing in pictures wearing NYPD gear. You know, he had a certain view of himself before that changed.
He was born in Queens, not far from where Trump was born.
The Boston Marathon bomber Tamerlan Tsarnaev, you know, aspired to be on the U.S. Olympic boxing team before his hopes were dashed when they changed the rules about legal permanent residence. The Chelsea bomber had dreamed once of being an FBI agent or a translator for the government working on terrorism issues. So I think when you look at the psychology of this, it is less refugees seeking freedom and escape from war and suffering, and more people who are suffering either series of personal failures here and then buying into an ideology that feeds that anger. But I'm not sure that the court stay here is imperiling the nation while they look at it. One of the issues here, Jim, is that these are new people in government, and they issued a series, not just this executive order, but a series of sweeping orders immediately to fulfill campaign promises that did not contemplate or seem to even understand the mechanics of government. Like when you issue an order like that, what do you do with the people who have already been vetted and already been issued visas and are already coming here or already are here, but they're coming from those countries possessing green cards as legal permanent residents? What do you do with all that? And when they issued the order, you know, it was a giant photo op, but didn't contemplate how the wheels of government would then turn to make it happen and how, which is why you see all of this confusion.
Well, one of the campaign promises was a ban on Muslims coming into the United States. He said it again and again. And then Rudy Giuliani said that they were identifying 7 countries to try to make a Muslim ban constitutional. Do you regard the January 27th executive order as a Muslim ban?
I think what you see in the campaign is campaign rhetoric. I think what you see in the definitions of, was it a Muslim ban or was it extreme vetting for countries that had high instances of terrorism? You know, all that language has been adjusted and readjusted and adjusted again in the course of transitioning from campaign rhetoric to government speak. But I think when you get down to the bottom line, or if you read the Constitution, we are not a country that bans religion. In fact, we banned the idea of banning religion when we wrote the documents that we stand on today as a nation. So that right there is off the table, which is why you have all the more complex rhetoric about, well, if it's not that, then what is it? In some ways, the order may have been crafted to be a de facto Muslim ban, but I think it gets back to my earlier answer, which is, before you get into the rhetoric, you have to get into the mechanics of how government will work this, A, and B, whether it's legal. And it seems that all of this, and we can do a whole other show on whether it's right, but it seems that all of this is happening too fast for either the bureaucracy or the legal system to digest it without saying, wait a minute, we've got to go through this in an orderly manner before we implement it, not after.
The executive order was limited to 7 countries, majority Muslim countries, in the Middle East. It omitted other countries in the Middle East where terrorists have come from: Egypt, Saudi Arabia. The 9/11 hijackers were mostly from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. There are other countries one could think of, Egypt. Was it appropriate to limit it to those 7 countries? Are they at the top of the hit parade?
They are now. I think if you looked at the 9/11 era and you would say, where were the people who were making up the backbone of al-Qaeda coming from, you would have said Saudi Arabia. 19 hijackers, 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia. I think if you look at Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was the organization that merged into Al Qaeda, so that would have made sense in the late 90s, early 2000s. If you look at today, Yemen is Al Qaeda's titular headquarters for attacking the United States. It's where AQAP, Al Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, is headquartered, where its best bomb maker is still operating. If you look at Somalia, that's where Al-Shabaab is got its stronghold. If you look at the 7 countries, from a counterterrorism standpoint, today, they probably got the countries right. The question is the order necessary? What does it add? And how is it supposed to work?
One can conceive of 3 kinds of terrorists who might threaten the United States. One, I suppose, are emissaries of ISIS or Al Qaeda, who a team that's ordered to come here and do mischief. Another is terrorists in the United States, or people within the United States who see ISIS propaganda on television, and how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom is one you've talked about before. And I guess the third is self-radicalized, who are inspired by ISIS in some way. But which do you find, in your experience, as the predominant category of terrorist threats?
Well, so you've broken it down. We have inspired. Those are the people drinking the Kool-Aid of the propaganda. You've got enabled. Those are people who are actually trying to contact the terrorist organization but have never met them or been there, who are getting targeting advice or additional inspiration or instruction. And then there's directed, and that's where they send a team from their camps. Think of the Bataclan theater attacks or the Brussels attacks in Paris or Belgium as directed. What we've seen here so far since 9/11 has largely not been directed. It's been either enabled or inspired. If you take the plots against New York, where men pled guilty just a couple of days ago to put pressure cooker bombs around the fireworks celebration of the 4th of July, that was an enabled plot where they met ISIS people on Twitter. They then went on encrypted apps and continued to communicate with direct instructions. If you look at most of our other plots, if you look at probably Orlando, Boston, the Chelsea bomber, these seem to be largely inspired by the propaganda. But remember, those are all people who are already here.
Let's talk about the Chelsea bomber, because, of course, you came in under Police Commissioner Bratton, but then continued after Jimmy O'Neill took over the police department in September of 2016. And shortly after he was appointed, he was confronted with the Chelsea bomber, and he handled it so admirably and assuring the general public. Where were you when you heard about the Chelsea bombing attack?
I was sitting in my car. We had actually a fairly significant counterterrorism operation going on that night that involved a completely different matter. The advantage was that we had a lot of people on a Saturday night, at 8:30, from Counterterrorism Bureau, from Intelligence Bureau, from the FBI's JTTF, already in place and working. So when the
JTTF is Joint Terrorism Task Force, for the
That's
uninitiated.
Right. That's the joint operation between the NYPD, the FBI, and about 50 other agencies, where you've got everybody working terrorism in one place on one team, looking at the same material. So when you had all of that talent in and working that night, the response was immediate, swift, and extraordinarily capable. I think the other blessing was you had Commissioner Bratton, who had left that Friday. This was Saturday, and you had Commissioner O'Neill, who was going to be ceremonially sworn in on Monday, but was effectively and legally the police commissioner at that point. But every day up until that moment, he'd been the chief of operations of the NYPD. So in terms of continuity, seamlessness, command and control, he had no learning curve. He had no hesitation, no doubt. He was there in a very short time in charge at the scene and was able to take command of that for the NYPD without skipping a beat.
What tools are in the counterterrorism toolbox, and did you use any of those in connection with the Chelsea bombing?
So we used all of them, whether that was reaching out to our sources of information, whether those are informants or undercover officers that night, to say, what are you hearing out there? Does anybody know anything? What's behind this? We used our foreign postings, 13 NYPD detectives who are in cities from Amman to Tel Aviv to Sydney, Australia, to London, to Paris, to say, what are you getting from our foreign partners in terms of any intelligence or guidance here? We used our response capabilities, having the Critical Response Command, our uniformed counterterrorism force, not only help with force protection at the scene to make sure that there weren't secondary devices or another attack coming, and there was. A second bomb was found just a few blocks away on 27th Street. So when we flick that switch during a terrorist attack, it all comes together. The Strategic Response Command was there at the scene. We were deploying resources to guard other potential terrorist targets that night. And at the same time, Jim, you'll recall that only every world leader on the planet Earth happened to be in town for the UN General Assembly a few short blocks away. So one of the things you don't do is let down your guard on primary targets, because there could have been an argument that the Chelsea bombing was meant to draw resources across town to open up other targets. So a lot of very fast thought. The synapses fire very quickly in these crisis situations, went into what to move and what to leave in place.
One argument that Trump launched during the campaign, and I think Giuliani as well, is that there ought to be a crackdown on Muslims within the United States, that we should cause them to register. The argument's been made that if we appear to be declaring war on Islam, that's exactly what the terrorists want us to do. Because we'll be taking on a large number of people, and also causing them to self-radicalize because they'll be antagonized by the policy. Do you agree with that?
Well, I try very hard as a police official, as I had before as a journalist, not to fall down the hole of discussing politics. What we operate by, though, is rule and law. And all political posturing aside, our rules are very clear. We operate our intelligence operations under the Handshoe Agreement, which was agreed to with a federal court judge overseeing it between the plaintiffs and the NYPD many years ago, about how we gather intelligence against U.S. citizens and New Yorkers. And those rules specifically prohibit religion being a factor in that. So the way we investigate, the way we protect New York, and I would suggest over a period of a decade and a half since 9/11, the NYPD can be credited with doing a very good job at that, is we look at people, we look at conduct, we look at intelligence, we look at law. If religion comes into the storyline as a fact, that may occur, but it's not a starting point, and it can't be.
Well, suppose you were asked to testify before Congress, which was contemplating a bill that required the registration of Muslims, and suppose it were legal to do that and constitutional to do that, and you were asked to confine your testimony to the impact on national security. Do you think it would improve or hurt national security if you had such a law?
I think it would have very little to do with national security. It's not really about national security. That's about posturing and rhetoric.
You think we're any safer in the world, or specifically in New York City, than we were on 9/11/2001?
Well, I think we're extraordinarily safer.
And why is that?
Because I think on 9/11/2001, we didn't have a concept of what the threat was. And when I say we didn't have a concept, we understood there was a threat, we understood there was terrorism. I don't think we as a nation or as an intelligence community had it within our frame of reference that a non-state actor, some ragtag group on a mountaintop or in a cave in Afghanistan, could launch multiple simultaneous attacks on U.S. soil and kill 3,000 people in a single day. So the fact that our concept was off, the 9/11 Commission called it a failure of imagination on our part to not be able to conceive that. We weren't protected against that. I think since 9/11, I know since 9/11, we have made giant strides in information sharing between intelligence agencies, information access between intelligence agencies, and I will caveat that with there's still a way to go there, and the ability to protect against terrorism, but also to respond to it. And I think if you look at New York, where we have prevented 20 plots through good intelligence and good partnerships with the FBI and other agencies, and where, too, the Times Square bombing, which flew under the radar, the bomb didn't function, so we were lucky there. Or the Chelsea bomb, where that individual flew under the radar, and where we were lucky there, even with 31 people hurt, was that was a bomb that would be roughly the equivalent of the Boston Marathon bomb, but nobody was killed. And that was about where and when he placed it, and the fact that that destiny took a hand that night in a very good way. But by and large, I think if you look at that track record, we're a lot safer. The difference, Jim, is that in the days of the 9/11 plot, the threat, if it happened, was extraordinarily high for a large, complex plot, like blowing up the embassies or toppling the World Trade Center or attacking the Pentagon. I think today the threat of what's going to happen is much lower in that you're going to have far fewer casualties, but now it's miles wide. It doesn't have to be a secret team sent overseas by al-Qaeda. People who are inspired by this are trying one of these plots every few weeks somewhere in the United States, and mostly they're getting caught. But if you look at the day of the Chelsea bombing, there was a bombing in New Jersey at a road race that day, perpetrated by the same individual. In the middle of the day, another individual inspired by ISIL propaganda went on a knife-wielding rampage through a mall in Minnesota, and by that night we had a bombing in New York City. And since then we've arrested others in other cases. So, this is a pace, a cadence that we've never seen before.
Almost a rash, like a disease that spreads. Now, we talked about the tools in the counterterrorism toolbox. I assume one of them is a show of police presence throughout the city. Now, we used to see squadrons of police cars roaming the city or near important sites in the city. We don't see that so much anymore, but we do see armored police officers with assault weapons at various points. Has there been a shift in strategy?
There has, and I'm really glad you asked that question because it's been on our learning curve. The way this used to work prior to Commissioner Bratton coming here and for a while after he got here was that I guess there was some idea that terrorism would eventually kind of go away. So they put together something called the CRV, the Critical Response Vehicle. And that was a police car that they would borrow one from every precinct in the city. So you'd get 77 cars, but also every transit district, so a few more, and every housing district, so you get a few more. And you'd put together 100 and something cars, and you would place them at potential terrorist targets. The issue was these officers were precinct officers who had no special weapons, no special training, no special ability to detect terrorism or great depth in what was the threat against the particular target they were guarding. In some ways, while it was a good temporary concept, over time it was just eyewash. They were scarecrows. When you looked at the attacks in Paris, where they confronted armed police officers with superior firepower and then killed them, executing one on the street in the Charlie Hebdo attack, a videotape a lot of us have seen and find very disturbing, or the Bataclan Theater, where gunmen with AK-47s, raked across a crowd in a concert, and when confronted by police, continued their attack. The CRV program wasn't going to do it. So what Commissioner Bratton formed was the Critical Response Command. These are not borrowed cops from precincts. These are highly trained officers, trained in the active shooter protocols. They have special weapons and tactics. They are briefed on the intelligence every day. They are briefed on the TTPs, the training tactics and procedures of the terrorists that the bad guys are using. These are specialized counterterrorism officers. So now when you see a team of officers guarding the Israeli mission, a UN location,
Trump
a government
Tower.
location, Trump Tower, symbolic targets. What you're seeing is not some cop who was borrowed from the 103rd Precinct in Jamaica because they said, Smith and Jones, go to Manhattan. You're seeing someone who does this for a living and who's properly equipped to face that threat if it comes.
Someone properly equipped. So I have a question for you, John Miller. And
Yes.
the question is, does Trump's travel ban do more harm than good?
I will say again, I'm willing to talk about the police department, intelligence, the threat. I'll stay out of the politics of it, but I think just to get into the government mechanics of it, when you write an order that instructs the government to do something without the government having a moment to contemplate what exactly is it we are doing, what are we not doing, and how's this going to work, what you get is confusion, delay, disarray, and I think that's what we're seeing now.
Disarray is what we're seeing now. So, John Miller, I'm sorry we've run out of time because it's been marvelous, and I hope you come back.
Well, thanks for having me,
Thank you
Jim.
so much. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.